All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the two of you who are here to listen to the talk. Since it's such a small group, I would offer that if people have questions throughout, we can make this really much more interactive rather than me just giving a monologue for 45 minutes or something. So if there's specific aspects that you would like to hear more about, just feel free to, pipe up, and I'm happy to adjust as needed. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, how does this work? Da-da. Banner, slideshow from start. All right, people can see the presentation. All right, good. So yeah, this is a joint work I've been doing with a colleague of mine in political science, Erlich, and Ziqi Chen, who was a postdoc with me and is now at the University of Manitoba in the Department of Sociology. And as you mentioned, this is work funded by SSHRC through an Idea Insight Development Grant. So to give you just a quick overview, basically what I'm going to be talking about is this project, what we call the McGill Study of Nigerians at Home and Abroad, where what we did is we surveyed Nigerian expatriates or Nigerian immigrants in 11 countries around the world, plus we collected a sample of Nigerians in Nigeria. And so this gives you sort of a bit of a sense of the geography of the data collection we did, right? So from North America, US, Canada, to European countries, UK, Germany, Italy, then countries in West Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, etc., and South Africa, Malaysia, and United Arab Emirates. So we try to cover the globe as much as we could. Here's a quick overview of the talk today, basically three parts. The first is why do this? The second, how, and then the third is the meat of it is an evaluation to see like how well does this work. And especially the third part is based on a paper that's just been published in the journal Sociological Methods and Research, it's called. Yeah, so that you can read more about it there. So why do this? Why use social media advertising? Why venture out in these new methods to study migrants? Basically, the basic idea is that surveying populations that are on the move is hard. Like, collecting data on people who are not sedentary is a non-trivial exercise. While migrants can be significant, there can be significant numbers of migrants in particular countries, like Canada has a lot of migrants, for sure. But any particular national origin population will always be a small minority. So finding them is hard. Like a surveying approach that just like takes a random sample will end up with very small numbers. We just don't have we don't have sampling frames for these populations. So there's no easy way of like targeted outreach for those populations. We don't often even know like what the population size and basic parameters are. And these challenges become even more hard if you're trying to do this in several countries around the world. So while I could maybe figure out a way how to assemble a sample of Nigerians in Canada, I've done this, for example, with the study you mentioned about the Syrian refugee population. That was a lot of effort to do for just one population in one country. If you want to do this across different countries, right, you have to reinvent different approaches in each country's collecting comparable data will be very hard. At the same time, exactly these kind of data, when you study one population from one place of origin in many places around the world, are theoretically important, right? I'm not going to go into details here, but we have a lot of, I think, interesting theoretical and policy relevant questions about migration can only be really answered with this kind of data. But these data essentially don't exist. So this is where we think Facebook, or maybe more broadly, sort of social networking site and targeted advertising using these kind of approaches can help. Just to preview a little bit, like what might be the challenges that one encounters using these approaches, right? So what you get is basically three types of bias. One is that you have populations that are systematically absent, right? That you don't even encounter online or on any specific social media platform because either they have faced various barriers to being on those sites, being in literacy, being in digital divides, being in whatever it is. Maybe a particular platform is banned in a country. The second source of bias is what we call categorization bias, right? Like this, as I'll explain in a little bit, the type of advertising, what the real power of this is that you can micro-target your advertising, right? That you don't have to advertise to all sorts of people, but you can really target these specific immigrant populations. Well, that entails a process by which the Facebook or whatever site you end up using has classified people as belonging to this population, right? And so we generally can't look into these classification algorithms, but there could be bias there. And I'll show you an example of this actually in the case, or we suspect what an example of this happens in the data collection we did. And then there's the more generic response and selection bias, right, that you have with any survey, right, that, you reach out to people, some people will respond, some people will not respond, and these are not random subsets. Anybody who's been doing polling for elections, they can probably tell you long and sad stories about these kind of challenges, right? Like, I don't know, I think the response rates for telephone surveys are in the low single digits at this point. So this is not unique in a way to doing surveys using these kinds of methods, but maybe may matter in specific ways. So these are the three main challenges one encounters. Just to give you a bit more context, I'm going to not talk about the whole study that we did in a way. I'm going to, especially when it comes to the evaluation, I'm going to talk about three particular subsets here. I'm going to talk about the Nigerians we served in Canada, Nigerians we served in Italy, and then the Nigerians at home, quote unquote, the Nigerians in Nigeria, because these are the populations where we could find relatively decent reference data to actually evaluate this method. Just quick basic overview here. So Canada has about, probably just north of like 50,000 Nigerians there. Most of them are prime working age and a relatively highly educated population. There's a much larger, in fact, Nigerian population in Italy with a very different background. Many of them are asylum seekers, less highly educated, certainly than in Canada, many engaged in sort of informal economy. There's a decent sized population of women who are sex workers in Italy as well. So very different types of populations. And then we have the Nigerians in Nigeria. For those who don't know much about Nigeria, fascinating country, 220 million people, basically. That's, half the size of the European Union population. The median age is I think just above 18 years old, so incredibly young and dynamic population, multi-ethnic, multilingual, many sorts of divides, north, south, urban, rural. And one particular challenge that we'll talk about is, a significant share of the population is illiterate, approaching almost 50% among women. All right, I'm going to very quickly go over of how we did this, only emphasizing, really a small aspect of this. There's a lot of technical details in the way the Ziqi Chen, who was the postdoc on this project, he could tell you all about this. I was only in a way somewhat distantly involved in this. Basically, what we did is we created a Facebook page that was called the McGill Study of Nigerians at Home and Abroad. And then through that Facebook page, we then purchased these online advertisements, right? This is gives you some sample of what they looked like, and you can, in the advertising settings, you can target those advertisings to be shown only to people who meet specific criteria, and in this case specifically, people who are classified as expatriates by Facebook in a particular country. So we would have these advertising showed to Nigerian expatriates in Canada or Nigerian expatriates in Italy or and so on and so forth. For the sample in Nigeria, we had a different approach. I think I'm going to skip over that. I'm happy to answer in Q&A how we approached it there. We did a whole lot of pilot testing of these ads, different designs, using different languages, all sorts of stuff to try to arrive at something that we thought worked the best. Again, something I can give you a little bit more detail about, and there's a paper we're working on that summarizes all this that will hopefully be out sometime next year. I want to just go into one particular aspect here, though, and that's what I would like to call community engagement and building trust, right? So one challenge is you put these ads out there, But then for people to really engage, they need to have some sort of sense that you're real, that this is not just a scam, that you're not just trying to get some information from them for nefarious purposes, or that you're actually going to deliver on the kind of promises. We had a prize lottery, so people could be compensated for their time if they won the prize, and so on and so forth. And so there's a number of things we did. The first is, of course, in a way, having a business page that is associated with McGill University, right, which has, still a decent reputation across the world. So that's something, a recognizable entity. We had a page with our biographies on it so people could check us out. This was, the research team at the time. So myself, my co-investigator, and then we had two Nigerian origin research assistants as well. And we put our bios up there. And then one thing we did, we invested a fair bit of time and energy into is actually keeping the page populated, right? So like a few times a week, we would post on the page. And what we did is we often summarized data that we had collected as part of our pilot projects on the page, and to sort of, in a way, give people a sense of this is what we're doing with the data. And while I don't have sort of a neat randomized control experiment evaluation of this, our strong sense is this was really important and really helped us in gaining trust and building sort of legitimacy of this project online. So something that was very much worth doing was a significant effort. We create these graphs, we posted them, we had sometimes short little blurbs about the work we did, and really try to maintain an active presence there, even before we started the field work, but then especially as we were rolling it out. Another quick thing I want to talk about is the moderation. So one of the research assistants that we hired was an undergraduate from McGill, and his job basically was once we went live, to respond and moderate the Facebook page. So people would go, they would see it as they can interact, right? You can leave a comment there. Oh, is this for real? Like, what do you want from me? They have questions like, how can I join? And so on and so forth. And so we had array, and this was basically a full-time job for the time, for those 3 or 4 weeks where we were collecting data. He was, I think, not 8 hours a day, but probably 5 or 6 hours a day. He was there responding to comments, moderating the Facebook page. And I think that was really important because people have questions, people want to get in touch, and he spent a lot of time doing this. This is just like some snapshots of this, of the kind of back and forth that we had going on the website. And I think that also really helped facilitate participation there. Right, this gives you a sense, then we sort of posted, and also again seeing like how people are participating. Our target was to collect 500, a sample of 500 in each of the countries of emigration, if you will, in each of the emigrant samples. And we had, I think, a target of about 2,000 or so among the Nigerians at home. We met or closely met our quotas in many of the countries. In a few countries, it was very hard, and we didn't get close. Malaysia, in particular, the Nigerian population is relatively small, so we knew that was going to be a challenge. Italy was also among the challenging countries. I think we ended up just shy of 300 in the end there. And in most other countries, we eventually got reasonably close to our quota before our grant money was exhausted. I'm going to skip over this for now, but if people have questions, I'm happy to circle back to it later. In Nigeria, we had a different approach. We did quota sampling. All right. Now, how well did this work? Like, how good quality is the data? How representative is it? Maybe as a little preface here, I'm just checking the time. Right, when it comes to collecting samples of migrants, in a way, this idea of having like a perfect single stage random sample is kind of like an illusion, right? That's almost not possible for these kinds of populations, right? So many, even the highest quality, most expensive surveys of these populations, have to make compromises somewhere along the line. And that said, right, we wanted to see like, well, is this data that we collected good enough that we can do something with it? Is it so far off of being representative that it might not be useful? Or if so, at least so we are aware of like what the shortcomings are and what are the kind of cautions and caveats one needs to keep in mind when working with this. It was surprisingly hard to find actual good reference data on this, which is part of why we settled on these countries. So in Canada, we used the 2016 and actually also the 2021 census in the end. So I updated this since this. In Italy, we drew on the labor force survey where we pooled 5 or 6 waves from 2015 to 2020, and then get a decent sized sample of Nigerians in there. How good that sample of Nigerians in the Italian labor force is, I can't really vouch for that. I think it's the best that we could find. I think it's probably of decent quality. Is that a perfect sample? I don't know. In Nigeria, even in Nigeria, it's not easy to find like sort of obviously a good quality reference data. The Nigerian census may or may not be that reliable, has very limited information, was also outdated. So we went to the Afrobarometer survey, which is, has a complicated but I think pretty rigorous sampling approach. We also compared our survey collected to what's called as Facebook audience estimates. Basically, before you buy an ad, Facebook gives you an estimate of like, this is the population that you could potentially read with this ad, but they provide only age and gender information. So we could also use those two as comparison. And obviously they have, even the Facebook audience estimate will already miss people who are not on Facebook, right? Remember the 3 sources of bias, right? Population bias, categorization bias, and response bias. Like even the Facebook audience estimate will have the first 2 biases in a way already built in, right? There's no way getting around this. There's going to be a fair bit of numbers now. I'm not going to go into detail. This gets very technical very quickly. So I'm going to go relatively quickly over this, but I'm happy to give you as much detail in the Q&A as you would like. Present basically the undistributions, and we calculate post-stratification weights where we don't constrain the weights. We basically allow the weights to get as large as we need to match these marginal distributions. And I'll talk a bit about the trade-offs there. Basically, intuition is, yes, you can match these marginal distributions, but at the cost of putting a lot of, weight or emphasis on potentially very few people, right? Let's say you heavily undersampled, highly educated women, then the 3 highly educated women that you have in your sample will have to stand in for this whole large population potentially, which is, problematic. And then we have sort of a compromise approach where we trim weights, right? Where you constrain the weights and how large they get, which then reduces this problem, but maintains certain biases. I'm going to give you the quick takeaway that we think we have actually relatively good coverage in terms of gender and region, like region within the destination countries. I'm not going to display those results in a way. And we think that education, attainment, and literacy is one of the main constraints that we heavily oversample more highly educated people. The degree to which this matters varies across populations. It's a relatively small issue in Canada. Remember, highly educated, highly select immigrant population. So there these issues weigh less heavily. There's a substantial issue in Italy that we can address with weighting, but you get what's called large design effects. And it really is, I think, kind of almost disqualifying limitation for Nigerians in Nigeria. All right. Again, I'm not going to walk you through each of these numbers. I tell my graduate students always, this is not the way to present these results, but there's really no other way of communicating what's happening here. It's just like, it's unavoidable. Is there a pointer, a laser pointer? I don't know. So this is the demographics in Canada. Basically, the first set of columns shows you the unweighted sample, and it gives you the population unweighted sample and shows you the bias, like how far off we are relative to the gold standard, in this case, the Canadian census. And I sort of highlighted cells that are, that I thought were like large by some subjective measure. Now, this is not terribly scientific. With color, there's this red-orange color when we're over and blue when we're under. And basically what you see is we're a bit over representing a particular age range here, the 35 to 54-year-olds, but otherwise we're relatively close. And then when you apply the second column here applies weights that are based on the Facebook audience data, right, where you get already some bias reduction there, and with relatively small what we call design effects, right? This is this last row here where it says Kish Def. And then if you use trimmed weights, you also get some decent bias reduction and with small design effects. And even with fully weighting to the margins, it's still like, I think values up to between 2 and 3 are still considered sort of like decent when it comes to design effects. Basically, this gives you some sort of summary measure of like how much unequal weighting do you give to particular people in the sample. So in Canada, this seems to work actually reasonably well, is maybe the takeaway point here, with some over and underrepresentation, but in a way that you can address through weighting without major issues. Now, what's one thing we can also compare besides these demographics is the period of migration. So in there, I think this is quite interesting. We see the black dots here are what the census is, and the gray dots are the various weighted and unweighted samples here. I'm not going to talk about the nuances here, but basically what you see is we underrepresent people who migrated earlier to Canada before 2000, and we overrepresent people who migrated later. And I don't know, but I think this has to do with this classification bias, right? That Facebook is more likely to classify people who migrated recently as expatriates, and so we reach them through advertising, and it is less likely to do so for people who have been in Canada for a long time. So that's, a limitation. Like if you're interested in questions that are related to period of migration, you obviously would have to be careful with this type of data collection approach. Okay, Italy. So in Italy, things look, as you can see, there's more color on this slide. Things are worse. I will also say, like in Italy was the place where we spent the most money in terms of on advertising, right? We ran the campaign for long, and in a way, the marginal respondent we were able to reach cost us a lot more in terms of advertising dollars than most other places. Again, we think this has to do with the relatively, precarious situation of these migrants, maybe relatively low levels of education, and factors like this that made them harder to reach. So again, we have bias in terms of age, gender. We underrepresent women, overrepresent men. I think women are especially precarious in Italy, as I mentioned. There's a decent-sized sex worker population there. And we have a very large underrepresentation of people with primary education or less. Applying weights, the Facebook audience weights or the trimmed weights can ameliorate some of these biases, doesn't eliminate them. Some of them ameliorate, some of them are not really touched that much. For example, the education bias is not really addressed by these weights that are not constrained. You can address this when we weight unconstrained to the labor force survey, but then as you see, we get these very large design effects of 10. I think sort of most serious survey researchers would not be happy with design effects of that size, right? That is an indication that you're really putting a lot of emphasis on relatively small subpopulations within the survey population you collected here. So that's the takeaway there. Unfortunately, there was no other variables besides the demographics. There was nothing else we could compare between our survey and the reference data. There was just no items that really matched. Going to Nigeria, and this is where you can really see where these things can go off the rails, so to speak, where we have, again, biases in age and gender coverage. I think the biases in age are, I think they're relatively minor, and weighting can actually address them to a decent degree. I think where the main action is education, and it's very clear, right? If you look at the most right-hand column here, which is basically the reference data or the fully weighted data, 41% of the population in Nigeria have a primary education or less, right? So, 2/5 of the population. In our sample, that's 2%. So we're basically missing essentially completely a large part of the population there. Um, and similarly, right, we're missing those with the secondary education, and basically the huge part of our sample is those with some post-secondary education, but that is a relatively small-ish part of the Nigerian population. And so there's a huge distortion there. And I think that distortion actually also drives the distortion or the bias we see in the gender ratio, because education is very unevenly distributed between men and women still, and certainly in large parts of Nigeria, not everywhere, but certainly in the north and in some regions of Nigeria. Right, again, yes, we can. If we really let the weights go wild, we can match these marginal distributions, but you get the side effects that are really like, extremely large, right? Where it's like, this is not, this is, I think, in my view, clearly beyond sort of reasonable there. We can also look at a few other variables here that we can compare. So we looked at ethnicity and religion. And even with fully weighting the data, right, we underrepresent certain ethnic groups. The Hausa, which is a predominantly Muslim ethnicity, mostly in the northern parts of Nigeria, is heavily underrepresented in our survey. Igbo are overrepresented, and so on and so forth. Again, same goes for religion. We underrepresent Muslims and overrepresent Christians. Again, this maps onto both north, south, and educational divides. So to sum up, basically, and then I guess I went fairly quickly, and we have good time for questions, is that my sense is that you get acceptable coverage of migrant populations with these approaches. And the reason is that migrants tend to be positively selected of the in origin country populations, right? It's the very poorest, the most marginalized, that are, in a way, they're too poor to move, right? They're stuck in place. So they're not going to be in these immigrant samples. And so in a way, that's why I think this approach works decently well. I think there are important limitations there too. These are not perfect random samples, but they may be sort of, it may be sort of good. It may be good enough, and it may be sort of the best we can do without, like, having millions of dollars at hand to collect these kinds of samples. Still, it's important to then be aware what the exact limitations are. I mean, I showed the issue of time of migration, and there may be many other issues that one wants to be alert to. I think one important thing to do is to be willing to spend significant resources on those that are hard to reach, right? In a way, the most valuable survey respondents are always those that are most reluctant to answer your survey, because they're going to be indicative of these of populations that you would otherwise completely miss. I think that was the lesson we drew from our data collection effort in Italy, right, where we really ran the campaign longer, and I think that in the end got us to a halfway decent sample in the end. So I think that's an important point. So for those who want to implement this, like, don't just be happy with the first 200 people that respond on the first 3 days of your campaign, but try to really go deep into the population and see that you can also reach those that are harder to reach. I think the hurdles are highest, certainly in the case of Nigerians, for those at home, right? And in a way also that the lesson is there that other survey approaches, like a standard approach of like contracting with a survey firm, telephone surveys, I mean, ideally a kind of a boots on the ground, face-to-face survey, it can be done there, because Nigerians in Nigeria are not a hard to reach and hard to find populations, right? They're everywhere, unlike Nigerians in Canada, where it's like, well, you need some kind of like tricks and targeted advertising like this. So in projects going forward, I myself would probably combine these in this way, right? I would not do Facebook-driven recruitment or similar approaches for the majority populations. I would use it only for the migrant populations, and then use traditional approaches to complement if I need these kinds of comparison samples to do that. I didn't display this here, but one thing we did, we basically reran all these numbers that I just show you, restricting the universe to those who are relatively highly educated, so those who have a secondary education or higher. And then, not surprisingly, things are not as bad, right? Because that's the main impediment here. But then, sure, you're more representative of that population, your weights get more reasonable, and the representativity on other dimensions also improves, but then you exclude a large part of the population. For some questions, that might be an acceptable compromise, but for others, probably not. To weighting, right? If you're interested in representativity, then trying to find reference data and create weights is good. I think that's going to be hard, right? We thought about like, hey, let's study the representativity in Ghana, right? There is no reference data. Nobody knows anything really about Nigerians in Ghana. That's just like, we could find some data on like the gender ratio, but I'm not sure how good that data is. So it's like it's hard. But if that reference data exists, I think that can help. Again, it doesn't correct for mismatches in all sorts of dimensions, right? And just in ones. You have these Facebook audience estimates, but they only correct for age and gender distributions, right? You don't have education distributions there. In a way, this population bias and categorization bias are built in. What you can address there is response bias. Yes, I'll leave it at that. And if John has any questions, we can have a quick discussion.
Hi, Thomas. Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I think we may have actually met at a conference last year in Montreal. It's nice to see you again. I have a couple of questions. I thought this was fantastic. I mean, I really appreciated the rich and the frank exposition of the strengths and weaknesses of this approach, and I just wanted to pick up on a couple of threads that you alluded to in the conclusion. This first question is not especially well formed, but I guess I would put it like this. Given the scarcity of some of these reference data, right? Even in the Canadian case, you're working with census and therefore demographic sort of population parameters. What are the lines of inquiry, as you put it, that are really well suited, and what are the lines of inquiry that are really maybe poorly suited to this approach?
Ooh, that's a good question. Hard one to answer. I mean, me and my co-author actually had debates about this. So he's a political scientist, so there's a large line of research that is interested in estimating the causal effects, like survey experiments and things of that nature. And we did, for example, in part of the survey, we had like a small survey experiment built in. And so you could say like, well, to some extent, right, if you're not interested in estimating population parameters, it would seem that maybe like representative is not such a big deal, except of course it does, right? Because you're making the strong assumptions about homogeneous treatment effects across all sorts of subpopulations. That may or may not be warranted, and you don't know if you can test it, right? So I think that's a challenge for anything that like estimates population parameters. Obviously, it's problematic because those hinge on these. Like if you're looking at correlations between variables, depending on what those variables exactly are, there may be you still get insights there, right? But you have to be aware that like, well, I may be missing certain populations. Right. I mean, I could still like, I could let's say if I have variables like take the Canadian case, right? I could still probably talk about, well, how does the experience of Nigerians change over time with settlement in Canada? Let's say if that's a question you're interested, right? You ask survey items related to this, and that's fine. You do have to, your sample of those who have been longer in the country is underrepresented. Now that doesn't invalidate your inferences necessarily, right? As long as you still have a decent sized sample. If you make the assumption that like the bias there is reasonably random, right? You're not missing on some other variable. I don't know. It's always a bit unnerving, I find, having these things. But like, what's the solution? Like, not do this research? I don't know. I mean,
I don't know if you'll permit Saad some further comments and questions. I have a very similar kind of reaction. I empathize a great deal, Thomas, that, as you mentioned, the once upon a time gold standard of random digit dialing I suppose it's random up front, but if only 3-4% of people are getting to the finish line, then significant questions raised. I look back at studies done in the 1980s in Canada, random digit dialing, and 2/3 of people would go to the end of your 30-minute telephone survey, and I can't imagine that would happen today. And so you're absolutely right. What's the alternative? To throw up our hands and do something else, or to sort of use the tools we have? Can I maybe push further on some finer points here, I guess, because you may have touched on this and I missed it. Can you develop a little bit more the costing for us, the costing of the advertisements, and then any compensation that would have gone to participants?
Yeah, I can do my best from my recollection. This was a highly technical. I was sort of overseeing this, but not in the weeds of this. With the compensation, what we did is we did essentially a lottery in each country, and I think we lotteried off 3 prizes. I think the equivalent roughly of like 100 Canadian dollars each. And now we draw on research that shows like, well, this helps participation, especially among people who are not intrinsically motivated to participate in research. Right, so those are the people you also want. I don't just want people who care about social science and will do the survey for free, if you will, but also people who you may have to incentivize with money. We didn't want to do straight up cash incentives for everybody because I think that would have created incentives for just a fraudulent participation, right? And we see some of that, right? We see that there's quite a few respondents who basically they went to the end of the survey, but they skipped over all the questions. Right. And so if you get to the end of the survey, you can participate in it's fine. I mean, whatever. It's nothing to me. But that's, we filtered those out. So you have that anyway. And so I think straight up cash. And it's also logistically then becomes very hard to do. I mean, what we did is like we piggybacked on the just amazing system of global money transfers that migrants themselves use, right? So we wire money to people's cell phones and all sorts of stuff. I mean, I didn't do it myself. My co-PI and the postdoc did this, but they had like accounts with all sorts of weird financial companies to make this happen. So that worked reasonably smoothly, actually. On the costing, so I mean, it's relatively affordable, right? So when we did this, in many countries, these ads didn't cost much. I can't give you at the top of my head. I mean, in some of these African countries, it was very, very cheap. I think we paid like, maybe it was like, I would say less than $3 for a completed survey in the end, if you calculate it out in terms of advertising cost, right? Which is, I mean, this has no way you're going to get even closer with any other method, right? I mean, you're talking about a factor of 50 before you know. We spend quite a bit more. I mean, North America is more expensive, right? Because that's, basically how it works is you're competing with other advertisers for these populations. And so Nigerians are not like the top market, but in the US and Canada, these ads were definitely more expensive. I forget now how much. And then in Italy, where we initially had a relatively small sample, but we thought like, well, we ought to be able to recruit something close to 500 here. And so we just kept spending. We just like, we basically blew the rest of our budget on Italy. And there, I think we ended up paying something. I mean, don't quote me on this number. I think it's like maybe $10, $12 in advertising cost per completed survey in the end. So those got quite a bit more expensive because we just kept, but therefore we got eventually these, much more marginal respondents, right? Because probably that's all these poor Nigerians saw on their Facebook accounts, like our ads eventually.
This is super helpful, Thomas. So just to clarify my sense, so let's take the Canadian case, for example. You're contracting with Facebook, and these ads just go out to the targeted individuals, like
Yeah.
at a frequency that is a function of how much you pay Facebook, or how is that? How does that actually? How do your dollars to Facebook sort of convert to ads in front of people?
That's a good, the details I cannot, it's basically, I think it's kind of like an auctioning system essentially,
Okay.
where I think there's an internal, market algorithm, how Facebook does it. So basically what we said is like, we set budgets for every day. like 100 to control our spending. We said like, $100 per day in Canada. We spend, and that then buys you a certain number of ads shown to people. There's then impressions, and then there's clicks, and then you can optimize in certain ways, right? And that's where this whole thing is really tricky because this is really designed. Facebook want this for people buy shoes or whatever it is, right? They want to, and so you don't, in a way, you want to show these ads to the people who are most likely to buy shoes, right? That's how the Facebook algorithm optimizes. I want to do the opposite in a way, right? I want to get the people who are least likely to answer the survey too, right? So you kind of have to work a little bit against that tendency.
That's helpful. And sorry to continue on the specifics piece. I'm being very greedy with question time.
Not
But
competing with anybody.
so when taking again the Canadian case, you'd go to Facebook and say, or you'd say to yourself, I'm committed to a maximum of $100 a day, and I'm in this sort of auction setup with potentially others. What are the parameters you can or did tell Facebook in terms of who you want to serve those ads to? You'd say,
Yeah.
I want people that you think, meaning Facebook, are Nigerian born. Do you tell them also that you want a certain distribution on age or gender? Or what are the parameters you would send to Facebook?
So that's a good question. So in the case of expatriates, we basically just send Nigerian expatriates. That's an advertising category in Facebook. So that's and that and there was no other restrictions there, basically. That's it. Now in Nigeria, and I told you like what we did is what we tried to do is that that really wouldn't work. Like if you just say Nigerians in Nigeria, right? Then the Facebook algorithm goes wild and basically gets you link clicks at the cheapest cost. And then you end up, I mean, we had pretty bad biases. You end up basically only highly educated, whatever, people who respond to surveys. And so we tried to create strata, right? Regions, rural, urban, gender, and we tried to fill particular strata to counteract exactly this sort of this maximization algorithm of Facebook. In the case of the migrants, we didn't want to do that because what happens is as the narrower and narrower populations you define, the more expensive these ads get. And so expatriates are already quite a narrow population. And so, if you put additional restrictions on that, one could try that to improve. On the other hand, on the parameters where we could do that, like gender and age, it wasn't so bad, right? We did pretty okay there. It was really other things where the coverage is an issue, and that you can't create quotas on this anyway.
Okay, again, super helpful. Maybe one last question. So I generally do in my work general population, online surveys, Canadian, American, elsewhere, and I'll often contract with a survey sample company, Leger,
Yeah.
in the Canadian case, for example. And so I have a good sense of the costing for what they would call a Gen Pop sample.
Right.
But I'm also interested in some potential future work and going back to them and saying, I'm looking for an oversample of X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
I don't know what their costing is going to be. As you point out, it's likely to be a lot more than sort of a general population sample. Do you have any sense, did you explore the alternative, like I say, of going to the Legers of Canada and saying, I would like folks in your opt-in panel who are born in Nigeria, sense of the sort of the cost comparison of the Facebook route versus a commercial sample firm?
We did not. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, you should send me an email that we can stay in touch afterwards. I mean, that would be definitely interested to hear what you're up to and so on and so forth. I mean, one reason was that, I mean, we wanted to do the same thing in a lot of countries around the world. Like, I don't know. I mean, sure, I could probably get Leger to do it in Canada. Who am I going to call in Ghana? I don't know. That's just not going to happen. And so we tried to like roll this out parallel, but it would be a good question. My hunch, again, don't quote me on this. I want to say like the Canadian data cost us maybe like $1,200, something like that for. And actually there we had like, what I showed you was our main round. We did a pilot in Canada that was incredibly successful. I think we got close to 1 in 10 Nigerians in Canada on the first rollout, because I think we were the first ones to ever do this. And there was just like this effect. where we got, I think for like a few $100s, basically, we got like this enormous sample. After the pilot, it wasn't quite as easy anymore. These scarring effects, I guess, set in pretty quickly. But my hunch would be it would be more expensive. There are companies now that basically professionally do this, what we did there. Right. So one could contract with them and they, they do this. And so I mean there's a bunch of extensions there, right? So one challenge is that this is a constantly evolving landscape, right? The rules around this change. You're always a bit in a gray zone when you do this use this advertising for this research. One really ought to also look at other platforms, right? We did this with Facebook because Facebook, that was sort of the easiest to do, but you can do this with all sorts of other social media platforms. You can do this with other sort of targeted advertising that online. I mean, this is the business model of this is how the online world, finances itself. How they make their billions and trillions of dollars. It's like that's what's happening. And so they're the professionals and like they can work across different platforms, right? I mean, in the end a social scientist. We're interested in a substantive research question, so I'm not going to spend all my time learning this. It's sort of an experiment. And we tried to do a rigorous evaluation where we could then for ourselves see like how does this actually work, rather than contracting out with some firm and then getting something back where you have no idea what happened. So that was the value of doing it yourself and learning and trying to see and push the envelope. But so one could go to these firms and ask, do a comparison. How much, I forget the name now. The co-author mentioned it to me yesterday, something called data, something else. Like they do this in the countries around the world. But yeah, it would be, I don't know how good the opt-in samples of Leger are in terms of Nigerians. I mean, I don't know how well benchmarked those are. I mean, reading the coverage of the US election, it seems like, these polls are basically like 80% statistical model now and 20% data or something like that. I mean, that's.
Thank you again, Thomas. I promise that was the last question, but I'll end on one last question if we have time. I know this was a methodology heavy talk and quite appropriately so, but I'm wondering if you could sort of highlight what you thought was the most exciting substantive finding for you from some of these surveys.
Yeah, well, we're still working through those eventually, actually. So in this, we kind of put out these methods papers first. But right now we have one paper. There's a bunch of them. One paper is, for example, we ask people on attitudes towards expatriate voting. So to what extent do Nigerians who are abroad think they should be able to vote in Nigerian elections? Nigeria is one of the few countries that doesn't allow expatriate voting at the moment, right? Many countries do. Nigeria doesn't. And so one interesting finding is that actually, this is where you can compare them to the Nigerians at home. And I think that comparison actually works because the Nigerians at home are relatively similar. They're not representative of Nigerians in Nigeria, but they're similar enough in profiles to the migrants in a way. So we can create good matched samples there. And we see that actually the Nigerians at home are more willing to extend the franchise to Nigerians abroad than the Nigerians abroad are even interested in the franchise than having the right to vote, which is not something I was totally expecting early on. Not a huge difference, but certainly in the wrong direction, statistically significant. And then we can sort of examine what are correlates, like who is more likely to support it and not. And I think there's some interesting preliminary findings there as well, right? How does this relate to like assessment of free speech, for example? Like, Nigeria has serious free speech issues, right? It's a democracy, but fairly repressive. There's journalists are constantly under threat. I mean, they famously turned off Twitter for a little while a few years back, and so on and so forth. And what we see, for example, is that Nigerians in Nigeria who feel free speech is more under threat are more interested in expatriates to vote, right? So as expats, the voice from abroad is outside of the reach of the arm of the repressive state and things of that. And then and so this is the kind of question, right, where you need these kind of match samples. And you will be hard to do otherwise.
Well, thanks again. That was inspiring. And
all right. Well,
congratulations.
Thanks for joining. And yeah, send me an email. I'd love to stay in touch.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Soul,
All
for
right.
that great talk and the detailed Q&A, and we can end it off there.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.